The dust kicked up by Samuel Crawford's boots settled slowly in the still afternoon air as he approached the old stone well at the edge of Clearwater Springs. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the desert landscape in shades of amber and rust. It had been a long day checking fence lines on the outer reaches of his ranch, and his horse needed water before the ride back to the main house. But as he drew closer, Samuel noticed something that made him pull up short. There, sitting on the worn wooden bucket beside the well, was a small figure hunched over in obvious distress. The sound of quiet sobbing drifted across the desert silence, and Samuel's weathered face creased with concern. The child was a girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with tangled auburn hair that caught the dying light like copper wire. Her simple cotton dress was dusty and torn at the hem, and her small hands covered her face as tears streamed between her fingers. She seemed so alone, so utterly lost in this vast expanse of wilderness. Samuel dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling softly as his boots touched the ground. He'd seen enough heartbreak in his 43 years to recognize the particular kind of sorrow that seemed to emanate from this child. It wasn't the temporary sadness of a scraped knee or a broken toy, but something deeper, more profound. "Hey there, little one," Samuel said gently, removing his hat as he approached. His voice was rough from years of calling to cattle across wide ranges, but he softened it as much as he could. "What brings you out here all by yourself?" The girl looked up with startled eyes, green as spring grass and rimmed with tears. For a moment, she seemed ready to bolt like a frightened deer, but something in Samuel's weathered face must have reassured her. She wiped her nose on her sleeve and stared at him with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. "I'm waiting," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze that rustled through the sagebrush. Samuel crouched down to her level, his knees creaking with the motion. "Waiting for what, sweetheart? Out here in the middle of nowhere." The girl's lower lip trembled, and fresh tears began to well up in her eyes. "My mama and papa, they said they'd come back for me. They said to wait right here by the well, and they'd come back." Samuel's heart clenched as he studied the child's face. There was something about her story that didn't sit right, something that spoke of cruel deception or worse. "How long have you been waiting, honey?" "3 days," she said, and the words seemed to tear at her throat. "Maybe 4. I lost count when the sun went down yesterday. Or was it the day before?" She looked around with the confused expression of someone whose world had been turned upside down. Samuel felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same rage he'd felt years ago when he'd first arrived in this territory and seen the way some people treated those who couldn't defend themselves. But he pushed it down, knowing that anger wouldn't help this child now. "What's your name, little one?" "Emma," she said, then added with a touch of pride that broke Samuel's heart. "Emma Rose Patterson. My mama named me after her grandmother, and Papa said the rose part was because I was beautiful like a flower." "Well, Emma Rose Patterson, that's a mighty fine name. I'm Samuel Crawford, and I own a ranch not far from here." He gestured toward the rolling hills in the distance. "Why don't you tell me about your mama and papa? What do they look like?" Emma's face lit up slightly at the chance to talk about her parents. "Mama has hair like mine, but prettier, and she sings the most beautiful songs. Papa is tall and has a mustache that tickles when he kisses my forehead. They bought a wagon and said we were going to California to start a new life. And they left you here." Samuel tried to keep the judgment out of his voice, but he could feel his jaw tightening. "They didn't want to," Emma said quickly, as if defending them, "but our wagon broke, and Papa said the desert was too dangerous for little girls. He said I should wait here where it was safe by the water, and they'd come back with help." She looked toward the horizon with such longing that Samuel had to look away. Samuel had traveled these parts for over 2 decades, and he knew that no responsible parent would leave a child alone in the wilderness, broken wagon or not. Either something terrible had happened to Emma's parents, or they had abandoned her with a lie designed to make her stay put until they were long gone. Neither possibility was one he wanted to share with the child. "Emma, honey, I think you should come with me tonight. My ranch isn't far, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Martinez, makes the best beef stew this side of the Mississippi. You must be hungry." Emma shook her head vigorously. "I can't leave. What if they come back and I'm not here? What if they think I didn't wait like they told me to?" Samuel's heart broke a little more. He'd seen this kind of devotion before, the way children clung to hope even when adults had failed them completely. "Tell you what, Emma, Why don't I leave a note here, tied to the well? That way. If your parents come back, they'll know exactly where to find you. And tomorrow we can come back and check again. Emma considered this for a long moment, her small face scrunched up in serious thought. You promise we'll come back tomorrow? I promise, Samuel said, and he meant it. He'd come back every day for the rest of his life, if that's what it took to help this child heal. As they rode back toward the ranch, Emma sitting in front of Samuel on his gentle mare, she told him more about her life. She'd been born in Missouri, but her father had lost his job at the mill and decided to try his luck in the California gold fields. They'd traveled for weeks before reaching this desolate stretch of desert, and Emma had been excited about the adventure until the wagon wheel had broken and everything had gone wrong. Do you think they're okay? Emma asked as they crested a hill and Samuel's ranch house came into view below them. Maybe they got lost trying to find help. Maybe they're looking for me right now. Samuel looked down at the small girl in his arms, at the way she still clutched a small rag doll that had seen better days, and he chose his words carefully. Emma, sometimes adults make mistakes. Sometimes they get scared or confused and make choices that hurt the people they love. But that doesn't mean it's your fault, and it doesn't mean you're not worth loving. Emma was quiet for a while, and Samuel wondered if she was too young to understand what he had tried to say. But then she lifted her striking green eyes to him and said softly, My mama used to say that when we need someone the most, someone always shows up in our path. Do you think you came into my life that way, Mr. Crawford? Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. He'd never been a particularly religious man, but looking down at this brave little girl, he couldn't deny that something larger than chance had brought them together. I think maybe he did, Emma. I think maybe he did. The Crawford Ranch house was a sprawling adobe structure that Samuel had built with his own hands over the course of many years. It sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills dotted with cattle, and a clear stream ran through the property, providing water for the animals and the small vegetable garden that Mrs. Martinez tended with such care. Maria Martinez had been Samuel's housekeeper for 8 years, ever since her husband had died in a horse accident and left her with no family and few options. She was a small, round woman with graying hair and kind eyes, and she took one look at Emma and immediately began fussing over her like a mother hen. Dios mío, where did you find this little angel? She asked Samuel in her accented English, already leading Emma toward the kitchen. She's skin and bones, and look at those clothes. When did she last have a proper meal? Samuel watched as Mrs. Martinez settled Emma at the kitchen table and began bustling around, heating up leftover stew and slicing fresh bread. Emma's eyes were wide as she took in the warm, welcoming kitchen with its copper pots and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. I found her by the old well, Samuel said quietly, pulling Mrs. Martinez aside. She's been waiting there for days for parents who I don't think are coming back. Mrs. Martinez's face darkened with the same anger Samuel had felt earlier. What kind of people abandon a child like that? In my country we have a saying, Los niños son flores que nunca deben marchitarse. Children are flowers that should never be allowed to wither. Samuel nodded, watching as Emma took tentative bites of the stew. She ate slowly, as if she wasn't sure the food would still be there if she finished it too quickly. I told her we'd go back to the well tomorrow to check for her parents. I don't want to crush her hope all at once. You did right, Mrs. Martinez said, patting his arm. Hope is sometimes all a child has. But this little one, she will need more than hope. She will need a home, a family. That night, Samuel lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Down the hall, Emma was tucked into the guest room, and Mrs. Martinez had insisted on sleeping in the chair beside the bed in case the child woke up frightened. Samuel had lived alone for so long that the presence of a child in his house felt both strange and somehow right. He thought about his own childhood, about the father who had been more interested in his whiskey bottle than his son, and the mother who had died when Samuel was barely older than Emma. He'd learned early that the world could be cruel and unpredictable, but he'd also learned that sometimes, if you were lucky, you found people who cared about you despite having no obligation to do so. Samuel had built his ranch from nothing, working 18-hour days and sleeping under the stars more nights than he could count. He'd told himself that he was building something lasting, something that would matter, but now he wondered if he'd really just been trying to fill the emptiness that had lived inside him for as long as he could remember. The next morning, Samuel and Emma rode back to the well together. Emma was quiet during the ride, and Samuel could see the hope and fear warring in her small face. When they arrived, the well stood empty and unchanged, with Samuel's note still tied to the rope where he'd left it. Emma climbed down from the horse and walked slowly to the well, her small hand trailing along the weathered stone. She sat down on the bucket where Samuel had found her the day before and looked out across the desert with an expression far too old for her years. "They're not coming back, are they?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel dismounted and walked over to her, his boots crunching on the gravel. "I don't know, Emma. I wish I did, but I don't." Emma nodded slowly, as if she'd already known the answer but needed to hear it from an adult. "Mrs. Martinez told me that sometimes parents have to make hard choices, and sometimes they make the wrong ones. She said that doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. Or Mrs. Martinez is a very wise woman," Samuel said, sitting down beside Emma on the ground. "And she's right. None of this is your fault, Emma. Not one bit of it." Emma was quiet for a long moment, and then she looked up at Samuel with those remarkable green eyes. "Mr. Crawford, what happens to children who don't have parents? Where do they go?" Samuel felt his heart squeeze in his chest. He'd been dreading this question, knowing it would come eventually. "Well, sometimes they go to orphanages, where there are other children in similar situations. Sometimes they find new families who want to take care of them." "Would you?" Emma started, then stopped as if the words were too frightening to speak aloud. "Would I what, sweetheart? Would you want to take care of me?" The question came out in a rush, followed immediately by a flood of words. "I know I'm not your real daughter, and I know I'm probably a lot of trouble, but I promise I'll be good. I'll help Mrs. Martinez with the cooking, and I'll learn to take care of the horses, and I won't cry anymore about my mama and papa." Samuel felt tears stinging his eyes as he looked at this brave little girl who was trying so hard to be strong. "Emma, you listen to me very carefully. You have every right to cry about your mama and papa. You have every right to miss them and feel sad, and even angry about what happened. Those feelings don't make you bad or troublesome." Emma's lower lip trembled, and Samuel could see that she was fighting back tears. "But if I'm sad all the time, why would anyone want to keep me?" Samuel reached out and gently took Emma's small hand in his weathered one. "Because sadness isn't the only thing about you, Emma Rose Patterson. You're also brave and smart and kind. You waited by that well for days because you loved your parents and wanted to keep your promise to them. That shows the kind of person you are inside, and that's the kind of person any family would be lucky to have." The tears Emma had been holding back finally spilled over, and Samuel pulled her into a hug. She felt so small and fragile in his arms, but he could also feel the strength in her, the resilience that had kept her going through the worst days of her young life. "I want to stay with you and Mrs. Martinez," Emma whispered into his shirt. "I want to learn about the ranch and the horses and maybe help take care of the cattle. Would that be okay?" Samuel thought about his quiet, orderly life, about the routine he'd built over the years and the solitude he'd convinced himself he preferred. Then he thought about Emma's laughter echoing through the house, about teaching her to ride and watching her grow up strong and confident. The choice, he realized, wasn't really a choice at all. "Emma, I would be honored to have you as my daughter. If you want me to be your father, then that's what I'll be. And I promise you, I will never, ever leave you waiting by a well." Emma pulled back to look at him, and Samuel saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope, yes, but also the beginning of trust. The fragile start of a bond that he knew would only grow stronger with time. "Can we go home now?" Emma asked, and Samuel realized that she wasn't talking about the well anymore. She was talking about the ranch, about the place where Mrs. Martinez would have dinner waiting, and where her new room had a window that looked out over the hills. "Yes," Samuel said, lifting her up and settling her on his horse. "Let's go home." As they rode away from the well, Emma looked back only once. Samuel thought she might be taking one last look, holding on to some final hope that her parents might still appear. But when she turned back around, she was smiling, and Samuel realized that she wasn't looking back in sadness. She was saying goodbye. The months that followed were a time of adjustment for all of them. Emma threw herself into ranch life with the enthusiasm of a child who had found her place in the world. She followed Samuel around as he worked, asking endless questions about the cattle and the horses and the land itself. She helped Mrs. Martinez in the kitchen and the garden, learning to cook and tend to the vegetables with the same determination she brought to everything else. But there were also difficult moments. Emma would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, crying for her mother. There were days when she would grow quiet and withdrawn, staring out across the desert as if she might still see her parents walking toward the house, Samuel and Mrs. Martinez learned to recognize these moods and to give Emma the space she needed to grieve, while also making sure she knew she wasn't alone. Samuel legally adopted Emma 6 months after finding her at the well. The process was simpler than he'd expected, given that there was no sign of her parents and no one else to claim her. When the judge declared her officially Emma Rose Crawford, she threw her arms around Samuel's neck and whispered, "Thank you, Papa," and Samuel felt his heart expand in a way he'd never experienced before. Emma's 10th birthday fell on a warm spring day, and Samuel decided to throw her a party. He invited the neighboring ranchers and their families, and Mrs. Martinez spent days preparing food and decorating the house. Emma had never had a birthday party before, and her excitement was infectious. As Samuel watched Emma playing with the other children, laughing and running around the yard, he marveled at how much she had changed in the year since he'd found her. The frightened, heartbroken child who had waited by the well had blossomed into a confident, joyful girl who seemed to light up every room she entered. "She's brought life to this place," Mrs. Martinez said, joining Samuel on the porch as they watched the children play. "And to you, too. You smile more now, you laugh. That little girl saved you just as much as you saved her." Samuel nodded, knowing that Mrs. Martinez was right. He'd spent so many years building walls around his heart, telling himself that he was complete on his own. But Emma had shown him that completion came not from isolation but from connection, from choosing to open your heart to someone else even when it meant risking pain. That evening, after all the guests had gone home and Emma was getting ready for bed, she came to Samuel's study where he was working on the ranch books. She climbed onto his lap, something she'd started doing when she wanted to have a serious conversation. "Papa," she said, and Samuel still felt a jolt of joy every time she called him that. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "Sweetheart, sometimes I still miss my first mama and papa. Is that okay? Does it mean I don't love you and Mrs. Martinez enough?" Samuel set down his pen and looked at his daughter, this remarkable little girl who had taught him so much about love and loss and the resilience of the human spirit. "Emma, loving someone doesn't mean you stop loving everyone else. Your heart isn't like a pie that gets smaller every time you share a piece. It's more like a flame that grows brighter when you use it to light other flames." Emma considered this, her small face serious. "So I can love my first parents and still love you and Mrs. Martinez." "Not only can you, but you should. The people who brought you into this world, who gave you life and loved you for your first years, they're part of who you are. I would never want you to forget them or stop loving them." Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. Mrs. Martinez said that families don't always start with babies. Sometimes they start with people who find each other and decide to love each other. She said that's what happened with us. "Mrs. Martinez is right again," Samuel said, hugging Emma close. "We found each other when we both needed a family, and we decided to love each other. That makes us just as real a family as any other." Emma was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Samuel with a mischievous grin. "Does that mean I can ask for a pony for my birthday next year?" Samuel laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet house. "We'll see about that, young lady. We'll see about that." Years passed and Emma grew into a strong, capable young woman. She learned to ride like a cowboy, to manage cattle, and to keep the ranch books. She also learned to read and write, with Samuel hiring a tutor to make sure she received a proper education. But more than anything, she learned what it meant to be part of a family, to love and be loved unconditionally. When Emma turned 18, Samuel gave her a choice. She could stay on the ranch and help him run it, or she could go to college in the East, or she could travel and see the world. He would support whatever decision she made. Emma chose to stay, but not just because the ranch was her home. She had fallen in love with Jake Morrison, the son of a neighboring rancher, and they were planning to marry the following spring. Samuel had watched their courtship with the protective eye of a father, but he'd also seen the way Jake looked at Emma, with the same devotion and respect that Samuel had always tried to show her. On Emma's wedding day, as Samuel walked her down the aisle, she stopped suddenly and looked back at the ranch house where Mrs. Martinez was standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," Emma whispered to Samuel, and he knew she wasn't just thanking him for walking her down the aisle. She was thanking him for finding her by the well, for giving her a home, for showing her what love looked like. "Thank you," Samuel whispered back, and he meant it just as deeply. Emma had given him purpose, joy, and a kind of love he'd never imagined possible. After the ceremony, as the guests danced and celebrated, Samuel found himself standing alone for a moment, looking out across the desert toward the old well where he'd first found Emma. Mrs. Martinez joined him, as she so often did during quiet moments. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gone to check that fence line that day?" she asked. Samuel paused for a moment, then gently nodded. "No, I don't have any doubt or hesitation about it. I believe Emma came into our lives to be our daughter, and we were meant to be her home. Maybe it was fate, maybe just a coincidence, but whatever it was, I'm thankful for it every single day." Mrs. Martinez smiled and patted his arm. "That little girl who sat crying by the well, she's gone now. In her place is a strong, beautiful woman who knows how to love and be loved. You did that, Samuel. You and your big heart." Samuel watched as Emma danced with her new husband, her face glowing with happiness. She caught his eye across the dance floor and smiled. The same bright smile that had first begun to appear in those early months after he'd brought her home. Emma and Jake built a house on the far side of Samuel's ranch and started a family of their own. Their first child was a son they named Samuel, and their second was a daughter they called Maria after Mrs. Martinez. Samuel found himself in the unfamiliar but wonderful role of grandfather, and he discovered that love could expand even further than he'd ever imagined. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the family was gathered around the dinner table, Samuel would sometimes think about that day at the well. He'd think about the crying child who had asked him who he was waiting for, and he'd realize that he'd been waiting for her too. He'd been waiting for someone to love, someone to care for, someone to show him what it meant to be truly alive. Emma never forgot her first parents, and she never stopped wondering what had happened to them. But she also never regretted the path that had led her to Samuel and Mrs. Martinez. She understood, in a way that perhaps only someone who had experienced both loss and love could understand, that sometimes the most beautiful things in life grew from the most painful experiences. When Samuel was in his 70s, his health began to fail. Emma moved back into the main house to take care of him, and she would sit beside his bed in the evenings, holding his hand and telling him stories about the ranch and the grandchildren and all the good things that had grown from their chance meeting at the well. "I want you to know," Samuel said to her one evening, his voice weak but his eyes still bright, "that you gave me the best years of my life. You taught me what it meant to be a father, and I couldn't be prouder of the woman you've become." Emma squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me, Papa. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." Samuel smiled, and for a moment, Emma could see the younger man he'd been, the one who had found a crying child by a well and decided to love her. "We saved each other, sweetheart. We saved each other." Samuel Crawford died peacefully in his sleep 3 days later, surrounded by his family. At his funeral, Emma spoke about the man who had shown her what love looked like, who had taught her that family was not about blood but about choice, about the decision to care for someone else even when it was difficult. The old well still stands today, though it's no longer used for drawing water. Emma visits it sometimes, especially on difficult days when she needs to remember how far she's come. She thinks about the little girl who sat there crying, waiting for parents who would never return, and she marvels at the way one act of kindness can change everything. Emma's own children and grandchildren know the story of the well, and they understand that their family began not with a marriage or a birth, but with a choice to love someone who needed love. It's a legacy that Samuel would have been proud of, a reminder that the most important things in life cannot be bought or earned, but must be freely given and received. And sometimes, when Emma sits by the well in the evening light, she can almost hear Samuel's voice asking that question that changed everything. "Who are you waiting for?" She knows now that the answer was always the same. She was waiting for him, and he was waiting for her, and in finding each other, they had found the family they were always meant to be. The wind picks up as Emma stands, her hand trailing along the weathered stone one last time. The sun is setting behind the hills, painting the desert in the same amber and rust colors that had surrounded her that first day. She thinks about all the children in the world who might be waiting somewhere, hoping for someone to find them, to love them, to show them that they matter. Tomorrow, she'll return to the ranch house where her own grandchildren are staying for the summer. She'll teach them to ride horses and tend cattle, just as Samuel taught her. She'll tell them stories about their great-grandfather, about the day he found a crying girl by a well and decided to change both their lives forever. She'll make sure they understand that love is not something you wait for, but something you choose to give, even when it's scary, even when it's hard. Emma walks toward her horse, her boots making the same sound on the gravel that Samuel's had made all those years ago. The desert stretches out before her, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. Somewhere out there, she knows there are other children waiting, other hearts that need healing, other families that haven't been formed yet. She mounts her horse and takes one last look at the well. The little girl who sat here crying is long gone, but her spirit lives on in every act of kindness, every moment of love, every decision to reach out to someone who needs help. Samuel Crawford taught her that family isn't about where you come from, but about who chooses to love you and whom you choose to love in return. As Emma rides toward home, toward the house where the lights are beginning to flicker on, and where her family waits for her, she carries with her the greatest lesson of all, that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the simple question, who are you waiting for? And the willingness to become the answer someone desperately needs. The well grows smaller behind her, but its significance grows larger with each passing year. It stands as a monument to the power of compassion, to the way one person's decision to care can ripple outward through generations, creating love where there was loneliness, hope where there was despair, and family where there were only strangers. Emma Rose Crawford rides toward the sunset, carrying with her the legacy of a man who taught her that the most important thing you can do in this world is to love someone who needs loving, and to never, ever leave them waiting alone.